folks. Thanks for jumping into our sixth session of the year. This is Alchemy's In the Lab, where we feature good topics, vendors, and both. So I'm excited to jump in today. We're going to be talking about a topic, and we're going to be featuring Rubrik, and we're going to be talking about not only cloud protection, but also how you can save money while you protect your data in the cloud. And we had a great panel of guests today. If you don't know me, my name is Pete Downing, the host, and I run our marketing here at Alchemy and been doing these for almost 3 years, if we can believe that. Also on the call, we got Mr. Doug Lind, who's been a past guest. And Doug, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're based, and what you do for Alchemy.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Doug Lind here. I am one of the principal architects here at Alchemy. I kind of have an oversight of cloud, modern data center, and most things data protection in some way, shape, or form. So I've been here for a little over 7.5 years, helping customers out be successful in their journeys through technology. And before that, I actually come from the customer side, where I spent about 21 years on the enterprise side of the world, building and running teams supporting data centers big and small across the world. So I am based out of Denver, Colorado, on a kind of halfway sunny, halfway rainy day, and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Well, I know you're a busy man, so thanks for jumping in today. And then next, we got Matt. Matt, I'm going to say your name. I'm probably going to botch it, but Castroda. Oh, man, I'm
close. Close. It's good. It's good.
But,
I've been giving coaching ahead of time.
from Rubrik. And Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and what you do for Rubrik.
Yeah. Thanks, Pete. Matt Castriata, I'm our field CTO for our cloud go-to-market, as well as our unstructured go-to-market here at Rubrik. 4 main pillars of data protection at Rubrik: the data center, cloud, unstructured, and SaaS. And I oversee two of those protection pillars. Here, I've been at Rubrik for 7 years. It's my 7-year anniversary today, as a matter of fact. So it's been quite a ride. I came from the data management space, so a long history and long career in data management before I came over to Rubrik to work on the data protection side of things. And yeah, I'm based in the Boston area, so happy to sync up with anybody who's East Coast based. And yeah, look forward to this discussion.
Nice. Well, thanks for jumping in. I know you're busy as well. All right. Before we jump in, for those who are not familiar with Alchemy, just a quick, 30-second pitch on who we are. Let me give you a quick overview. Alchemy was founded 9 years ago, and we're one of the fastest national VARs in North America. So VAR meaning value-added reseller. And I joined Alchemy just 3 years. I just celebrated my 3-year last week. And our goal is simple. We try to hire the best talent. So Doug being a great example of that. Doug covers a lot of different expertises and is one of the smartest guys in the company that I know. We focus on key technology. So our goal is not to sit here and try to boil the ocean and partner with everybody. We partner with a core group, and we try to be the experts at those technologies. And then we develop trust with you, the client, and the customers. We're not just focused on, transacting and running away. We want to build that trust and be a true advisor to you. And how that's done is we curate the right team. And, through that, we focus on different practice areas. So you can see there's a bunch of different areas we focus on. And then finally, we are, experts in our domain. We have 30 plus Partner of the Year awards. We are continuing to grow fairly rapidly across the US. And we offer not only product, but very strategic consulting and advisory services. And we are private equity backed. So we're not going anywhere anytime soon. This is our expertise. I like to show this slide because it shows you what we cover. We cover everything from cyber all the way over to app development. And yes, we have a full app development team. So if you're doing any app dev products, agentic AI, you need help doing workflows, we have teams to do that. Anything around AI, we have a great team on that, data analytics, et cetera. So we focus on the gamut when it comes to enterprise IT. And today we're going to be focusing on cloud infrastructure, backup and storage, et cetera, with Rubrik. And we got a great panel, and I'm excited. So let's jump in. And before we do, Doug, you're going to give us a little overview on why, Alchemy and Rubrik are partnered and what you're seeing kind of out there today and kind of set up Matt to show his stuff.
Sounds good. Thanks, Pete. So, like I said earlier, I come out of the enterprise space. I built teams supporting very large, data center infrastructures. And one of the things that we always said was backup is easy. Anybody can back anything up. It's trying to get it recovered is what the hard part is, especially trying to get it recovered at scale when need to and trying to do it quickly and efficiently. Now, when I was on the enterprise side, cloud was just kind of very much of an infancy when it comes into that. So what we were trying to do at the time was really build out the solution on the enterprise side of the world that we could go through and work with our data protection environment. Because really, at the end of the day, when companies are successful, they're really successful for two things: who they have and what they have. And that data is extremely important when it comes to how you operate, what you're trying to do as a company, how you're able to succeed, what your special sauce is. All of that really is built into the data. That's why we're here. I mean, as IT folk, that is, our charge when it comes into that data protection realm. So everything kind of comes out of that. And over the past probably 8 or 10 years or so, one of the ways that I've found this is I've really kind of gravitated to Rubrik, the Rubrik story, and how they actually interact. Ultimately, they are, at this point, one of the industry juggernauts when it comes to a data protection story as a whole. So they are extremely customer focused when it comes to what they're trying to do, how they're trying to accomplish, the insight that they're able to bring into your data, the security aspect. All of that is housed in that customer focus type of scenario. One of the things in my role now, I get the wonderful opportunity to talk with customers from, 10 people to 100,000 people or more. What I really like about Rubrik is they scale to have that focus from small to large, and they can have solutions all the way throughout there to go through. They're also based from an infrastructure perspective all the way to an app perspective. So infra to app, prem to cloud. Like I said, when I was on the enterprise side, cloud was its nuance. We were just beginning to build out. We actually had the opportunity to build out one of the larger services in Azure at the time to be able to do some extremely cool telecommunication things to go through there. And that was one of the first, large scale applications that Azure was able to bring on at that point. I would have really loved to have been able to have Rubrik back then in that cloud offering because there were a number of things that we were looking for. Most of that app was kind of transient and kind of pop up, but our core data that was out there, we did not have a great method to protect that data. We did not have a great way to be able to say, we know what's going on. We have security sight, we have insight, we have AI that goes all the way through this cloud data to go through. And one of the things that Matt will talk to a little bit later is what we saw were the native tools were okay, especially at the backup side, but recovery was hard. The automation around recovery was extremely difficult at that. Now, as I've talked with some of my old team, as that solution has grown and ebbed and flowed, now there are pieces and parts and pieces of that application across prem, across multi-site on-prem, between multiple different hypervisors coming across the world. It's baked in both Azure and AWS, and I believe they have pieces and parts that are starting to go into GCP in it. So when we think about that holistic data protection, having that single pane of glass that we can use insights to be able to gather that information, Rubrik is one of the only people that can actually accommodate for that. And they have that ability. They have that, span to be able to say, let's do this. Let's do this multi-cloud. Let's do this prem. Let's get these multiple hypervisors in here. We can start small. And then, two of the things that we've really kind of talked through, or three of the things that we've really kind of talked to, is the app intelligence, not just having a snapshot of a disk from a VM protection perspective, but really understanding the application that it's doing, whether that is some type of database driven, whether that is identity driven, whether that is a SaaS solution, backups, containers, all of that app intelligence helps to provide insight, make recoveries easier, make them more targeted, and ultimately make them faster. The extra security that they bring on, and one of my favorites is really that automation around how they're being able to recover in a large scenario, really is special to me. And I really do kind of gravitate to that story. So as we walk through customers and kind of what I see, all customers are growing in some way, shape, or form. We are asked to do more with less across many types of things. Most customers that we're talking to are not just a single cloud platform. They are multi-cloud. They have lots of SaaS type services, but they still want to have that single platform growth. So it doesn't matter if it's prem, cloud, SaaS. I really do believe Rubrik is the way to go from a data protection perspective. And when it starts to get into that cloud protection realm, more specifically around the kind of the big three from a hyperscaler perspective, I'd like to introduce Matt Castriata, working from Rubrik, to be able to dive into that further.
Thanks so much, Doug. Appreciate the intro. Appreciate the kind words. Thank you to everybody who's joined here today. Our goal is that you learn a little bit about how Rubrik is approaching protection in the cloud, because some of the, as Doug mentioned, some of the nuances are fairly unique to cloud environments. So it is important to have a solution that not only ties those things together, but understands essentially the economics of cloud. So we're going to talk a lot about not only how Rubrik can help with the economics, but also how it can help around complexity. And I guess one of the biggest things that I'm encouraged by from the polls that Pete had put out there is that most people are actually doing something about data protection in the cloud, because it's not a foregone conclusion. Sometimes customers think that they put their data in the cloud and that it's safe and it's secure. But there is something called the shared responsibility model that all cloud providers ascribe to, in that they're responsible for the uptime and the performance of the service itself. They're not responsible for your data and for the the validity of the data that's out there. If that data becomes impacted, whether it's deleted maliciously or whether it's encrypted maliciously, it's your responsibility to bounce back from that. You have to ensure that you have a capability to do that. And it sounds like, based on the poll here, that most folks understand that and understand that their part of the shared responsibility model is ensuring that the data itself is protected. We're going to talk through how Rubrik does that uniquely. We're also going to talk through how Rubrik can do that spanning on-prem across multiple hyperscalers and even into the SaaS space. So what we're going to start is just start really high level. And it's actually, Pete and I didn't plan this, right? He put a poll out there saying, what are your biggest concerns in the cloud? Complexity and cost were two of them that were on that poll. It was not something that we planned. It just kind of happened. And it is because, Alchemy, coming at it from the application perspective, sees customers going through these challenges and understands that these are very typically challenges that are, that their customers and our customers will go through. And the complexity angle, it applies across the board, not just to native, but most very, native, I think, really brings out sort of the complexity angle. Because what happens is the cloud providers are talking services to you. They come in and they discuss, services and performance of services and how you can leverage specific services within their estate to be able to build your applications. They're not talking to you about RTOs and applications. It's just not something they're talking about. So because the services are all bespoke, the backup for each of those services is all bespoke. And where you can store those backups, again, is very specific. So the services themselves are very specific. The backup management for those services are very specific. The EC2 team at AWS has no idea what the RDS team is doing, and vice versa. Everything is developed in isolation, therefore leading to sort of this sprawl, this tool sprawl. If you're doing it in a single account with 20 services, then it's fine. But most of our accounts, most of our customers are multi-account, multi-region, and even multiple hyperscaler. So as you sprawl out and you grow your data estate, and I think, Doug brought up a really great example of that telco app that started in Azure and now has hooks and tendrils into AWS and into GCP and even on-prem. As you start to do that, it just becomes very difficult to manage the sprawl that occurs. And we all know that tool sprawl is the enemy of RTO. If you need to recover and you have to go to multiple tools to do it, it's just going to take you longer to do it. It's physics, right? So tool sprawl being the enemy of RTO and being able to tie that all together is really, really critical. The second, and we'll talk about this pretty in some detail here, is just around the cost angle. As I mentioned, because the services are very bespoke, the backup management around those services is very specific to the service itself. The storage constraints that the cloud providers put up are very specific as well. EC2 data has to live in a snapshot tier for a certain amount of time before it can get vaulted to a standard tier, before then it can get vaulted to an archive tier. And there are very specific guardrails on how long that data needs to live in each tier. And while that may meet the need for RTOs when it comes to a tier 0, a tier 1 application in your organization, that may not meet the need for a tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 application. So having the ability to store data in any tier of storage is really critical, not only to ensure predictability and cost, but also to increase efficiency on where data is stored. We know that backup storage, and this is just from our research with our own customer base, we know that backup storage in the cloud typically represents 15 to 20% of overall cloud cost within an environment. If we can reduce that line item by 25 to 30% by just being intentional about where backup data is stored to meet the customer's RTO requirements, that's going to give you immediate cost savings. And what we hope is the ability to fund Rubrik within the environment. So that's really the cost angle. We're going to go a little deeper there. And then on the cyber components, we can't overlook this. I think Doug did a really great job of kind of introducing how Rubrik goes beyond just data protection and really looking at the visibility of the data itself, understanding what happened to the data if it's impacted, understanding if there was any sensitive data that might have been in scope, on that system, and then the ability to understand if there are any threats, latent or that have already detonated within the data set. And you might be saying, Matt, there's no such thing as malware in the cloud. There's no such thing as encryption in the cloud. And 5 years ago, you would have been right. 5 years ago, if someone had breached a cloud account, they would probably just be spinning up some services to mine some Bitcoin and chewing up your credit card. That could be, and we still have adversaries that do things like that. But that has evolved into a denial of data attacks, things like mass deletion. That was sort of the evolution of that, where, if you gain administrative access into a cloud account that has an overly permissive role to that can span multiple accounts and multiple services within those accounts, then you're in a situation where a lot of your data is vulnerable. And mass deletion was becoming sort of a calling card of cyber attacks in the cloud. Last year, we saw an attack called Codefinger, and I think that some folks on this phone might be familiar with that. This was where the attackers actually generated their own encryption key from the customer's own KMS, and then held that key hostage and re-encrypted the customer's data with their own key. That's encryption. That's a very similar hallmark as to what we see on-prem. And we know that threats are becoming more sophisticated in the cloud. The tactics, techniques, and procedures that attackers use in the cloud are becoming more sophisticated. Read all you can about Scattered Spider and what they're doing out there today. They have an entire breach protocol specific to cloud and cloud environments. And they know that, the cloud is vulnerable, either through leaked credentials that end up on an AWS key that ends up on a site somewhere, or through phished credentials. Either way, they're gaining access and they're infiltrating the cloud accounts. It's even more critical today to ensure that you have data protection in the cloud. What was heartening to me was to see in that poll that most people are doing something about it today. And that's really, really, really critical. Whether you decide to do it with Rubrik or not, that is critical and is first and foremost the most important thing. So why is cloud data so difficult to secure? It all has to do with the fact that it's born in lots of different places, right? It could be born in IaaS services like VMs, could be born in PaaS services like SQL databases, Azure SQL, RDS, could be born in SaaS services like 365, Microsoft 365. It is born in lots of different places. Much of that data is sensitive, and there are different personas operating against those data sets. Some of those personas have overly permissive access into the entirety of that data estate. If any of those personas become compromised, because we know the attackers are gaining access to the environment, not necessarily through vulnerability exploits, which are still an attack vector, but through a credential leakage and phished credentials. If they're gaining access into the environment, these questions are going to need to be answered. These are the same questions that are going to get asked on-prem. How do I recover from an attack in the cloud, whether that's encryption, deletion, whatever? How do I recover? How do I prove it? Who owns the recovery? In the on-prem world, that's fairly straightforward. That's usually an IT ops persona that owns recovery of on-prem assets. In the cloud, that's not as clear-cut. It could be that it could be an app owner for a specific app that owns specific accounts in the cloud that became compromised. Ultimately, who's responsible and owns the recovery for the cloud? Do I have an inventory of my assets in the cloud? Do I understand what's sensitive and what's not, and how those assets are ranked within the environment? And then ultimately, can data be exfiltrated and stolen? If they gain access and we live under the auspices of assume breach, we should also live under the same auspices in terms of assume exfiltrate. If they gain access to sensitive information, they have most likely found a way to exfiltrate that from the network. And if you're doing this in a single account with a set of services, 20 services or whatever, I would say you probably don't need a third-party tool. You have the ability to do this with cloud native tools today. It's fairly straightforward. You might have different backup policies for every one of those services, but it's manageable in a single account. But that's not how most of our customers are deployed. Most of our customers are deployed multi-account, multi-region, multi-hyperscaler. And once you live in that world of hundreds of accounts across 3 regions and across 3 different hyperscalers, it becomes something that's very, very difficult to manage and maintain from a complexity and also from a cost perspective, given your limited ability to put backup data where you need to. So on the cost front, this is some examples. This is specific to Azure VMs. This is their model. Lives in the snapshot tier for a day, vaulted to the standard tier for 30 days, and then from there goes to the archive tier and can live in the archive tier. Now, again, that may be okay for your tier 0 or tier 1 application. Keep in mind, the reason why they put these guardrails up is more as a CYA type of scenario. They are not having RTO discussions with you, as I mentioned earlier. Their discussions with you are focused solely on services and service consumption. So because they're not having RTO discussions with you, they put up these artificial guardrails on where to store backup data so that they cover off on the most frequent recovery scenarios, right? I may be recovering from within the last 30 days. So of course, I'm just going to say, hey, keep that in the warmer tier so that you have, the RTOs that you need. Rubrik and Alchemy as well, coming at it from a different perspective. We understand the applications that you're running in those hyperscalers. We know the importance of those applications to your business, and we're going to develop a strategy on backup retention and frequency that meets the need and the RTO need for those applications. And we could, if the application dictates it, immediately archive data to a cool tier. And that's going to save you money immediately right off the front. And it becomes even more apparent when you start talking about unstructured data in the cloud, large scale unstructured data in the cloud, particularly data that's stored in blob or in S3. And I have an example for S3 as well, that having optionality on where to put your backup data is going to give you cost and RTO efficiencies. With EC2, it's very similar. They'll store full backups in the warm tier. And then in the archive tier, unfortunately, those backups can only be fulls, and they can be archived more quickly to the archive tier. But again, only storing fulls in the archive tier, it's just a limit in their capabilities and their ability to be able to store data in an incremental forever fashion. We can be incremental forever. We can store to any tier. That's going to, again, give you those efficiencies from a cost and from a storage perspective. And the last example I'll use here is S3. And as I mentioned, it gets just more apparent as you start spanning out into large scale unstructured data. Within S3, you only have an option to store data in the warm storage at 5 cents a gig a month. And if you're talking about multiple petabytes of data, that becomes very, very untenable very quickly from a cost perspective. Having the ability to be able to store data in multiple tiers, depending on those RTO and cost requirements, are going to be really critical. From a workload coverage perspective, here's what we have out there for workload coverage. Some notable additions. Recently, we launched in GA protection for DynamoDB. We are excited about that. There are a lot of customers that are using DynamoDB as their NoSQL option within AWS. So we're super excited about that. Also, just recently introduced immutability for IDS, which the US cannot do natively because we essentially rubricize the data. We'll orchestrate the snapshots, the snapshot APIs that the cloud providers give us, but we'll rubricize the data before we store it on the back end. And one of the rubricized, functions is to apply object lock to every object that we write out to an S3 target. That's going to ensure that that data is immutable, right? With an object lock turned on, you can't delete the data, even if the bucket has the ability to be able to be deleted. The objects would still live on for the length of their retention. And that's how object lock works. That's how US ensures immutability within their own cloud. And that's how we're doing it as well. We're using the tools that AWS is giving us to ensure that we have immutability. Now, where it gets really tricky is the air gap. Having a vaulted account within the same org may not give you the air gap that you're looking for, especially if it's under the same identity domain, right? The whole point is identity domain isolation, that your backup accounts and where you store your backup data should be vaulted to a separate identity domain. Because if it's not, it's vulnerable, full stop. So it's really critical to ensure that you look at the identity domain as you're looking at where to store backup data, because credential isolation is very critical when it comes to ensuring that you have an air gap of your backup data within the cloud itself. And Rubrik can ensure that either through our own managed storage service, Rubrik Cloud Vault, or we can do that as a best practice and best practice guides around vaulting accounts and bunker accounts. So again, this is the workload coverage across AWS, Azure. As you can see, AWS and Azure very mature. GCP and Oracle, emerging maturity, right? By the end of the year, we should have coverage for GCS as well as Cloud SQL within GCP. So we're really excited to extend the workload coverage out to GCP. We're going to be doing a lot more with GCP here in the near future. We're really excited about Cloud SQL and GCS coverage within GCP coming here in the near future. And then in Oracle Cloud, we're just getting started. Right now, it's just, protecting those Oracle databases that might be running on Oracle in its instances within the cloud. We're going to continue to grow out our footprint within Oracle Cloud as well. Oracle's done a really good job of moving their customers into their cloud, and we want to follow their customers where they're at in their journey. So this is the workload coverage. Feel free to take a snapshot or a screenshot of this. This kind of Rubrik's coverage within the hyperscalers and is up to date. Now, the last thing is let's talk about cyber. And this is the one that I think is the most interesting for me. I actually helped to bring a lot of our cyber capabilities to market back in the early 2020s. So I have a very cyber and cyber preparedness and cyber response is very near and dear to my heart. On the preparedness side, these are all things that would happen left of boom. So when we talk about boom, boom is the incident. Everything left of boom is what you do to prepare for the boom. Everything right of boom is what you do to react, right? So there's prepare and react. On the preparedness side, the ability to understand the type of data I have and who has access to it. That's it, full stop. Because if you can limit the type of data that you have and that you store within your systems and ensuring that your sensitive data is stored appropriately and securely within your organization, and that you've also limited identities to only have access on a need-to-know basis to sensitive information within the environment, that's going to help you to prepare for an attack and is really going to help you. And when it comes to ensuring that sensitive information doesn't make it out to the bad guys. The bad guys' number one objective is not to delete data or encrypt data. That's really just them flipping off the lights on the way out the door. Their entire objective is to find and exfiltrate sensitive information so that they can monetize it. And they will monetize it. regardless of whether they tell you they won't release it or they will. So again, understanding the type of data you have and understanding the identities and how they map to that data is really critical on the preparedness side. And on the response and recovery side, I think Doug did a really good job by saying, it's not about backup, it's about how quickly can you recover. Part of recovering quickly is understanding what happened. What was the scope of the attack? What sensitive data was out there and what threats might live within that data set. And doing that within data recovery is really critical. And again, we can do that recovery across cloud, SaaS, and on-prem. And we're doing this all on a single platform. There's a single scan that goes on that will identify the risk to your data, map that to identities, give you the ability to have recovery, guaranteed recovery or insured recovery. That means recovery of backup copies that are immutable and air-gapped, and then the ability to understand if there are any threats in the data, whether those are threats that are latent that haven't detonated yet, or whether those are threats that have already detonated and you don't want to recover the threat back and reinfect yourself. And if you're not familiar with Rubrik, these are hallmarks of Rubrik in general across our stack. This is not specific to cloud. This is cloud, on-prem, SaaS, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is it's no additional infrastructure, no agents, no impact to production, and no learning curve. It is very, very easy to get up and running on Rubrik. The last thing I'll kind of bring this to a close, the cyber talk track to a close, is specific to recovery. When you go to recover, these are the required capabilities that you would need to be able to recover from a large-scale cyber event. I am not talking about operational recovery. Operational recovery is recovering from a known incident, fat finger event, somebody changed something unintentionally. The operational recovery is easy. Cyber recovery is hard because cyber recovery is by its nature is an unknown event. So are my backups survivable? And as I mentioned, it's really critical to ensure that every backup is immutable and air-gapped. And the air gap in the cloud is all about identity boundaries and separating your backups from your primary identity boundary. That's what it's all about. And if you can ensure that, then your backups will be there when you need them. You want those copies ideally to be available locally within the same region within a cloud provider, not necessarily within the same org or account. You want it to be in the same region. Why do I want it to be in the same region? Because it's going to be much faster to recover from something locally than it will be from something that's in a different region or behind a firewall somewhere. And then the other required capability for ensuring survivability of backups is if someone does gain administrative access and compromises identities and gains access into the backup system, you want to ensure that they can't do anything bad to the data, even if they tried to. Things like quorum authorization, two-person rule, will ensure that if somebody does a destructive action within Rubrik, and a recovery is a destructive action, that if someone does a destructive action, that they need another person within the organization to sign off on it before that action can occur. Likewise, if somebody tries to shorten retentions on a backup policy, ensuring that it requires somebody else within your org to sign off on that. We want to ensure that even if they were to gain administrative access into the Rubrik environment through some sort of compromised identity, that they still would not be able to do anything bad to Rubrik in general. The next is around understanding the blast radius of an event. What happened? Because as I mentioned, a cyber attack is not a known event. It's an unknown event. What happened? What was impacted? So coupling anomaly detection with things like data deletion markers or encryption markers will give you really that understanding that something valid might have happened to my data. Because if you're just looking at anomalies, it's going to create too much noise. Users create anomalies all the time. So having anomaly detection and isolation is not valuable. But having anomaly detection that then looks at the data and determines that there were deletes that seem out of bounds here or encryption markers that seem out of bounds, that's where you're going to get the canary in the coal mine. Something that you can react to and not sending alert fatigue into your SOC. That's really critical. Understanding what was impacted across the estate because it's stored in PaaS services, IaaS services, as I mentioned, everywhere within the cloud. You need to be able to, in a single control plane, be able to tell what happened. And was there any sensitive data on those systems? Not only proactively to, reduce your cyber risk, we already talked about that, but as well as reactively. If a system's impacted and you go to see if there was any sensitive data on it, guess what? How are you going to be able to see that there's sensitive data on a system that's encrypted or on an S3 bucket where a bunch of objects have been deleted from it? You have no idea. So in order to use the backup as a time series to go back in time and understand what happened, was there sensitive data on that system 3 days ago? It was really, really critical. So doing it at the source, reactively, proactively to ensure that you're locking down and reducing your risk, but also reactively after an attack to understand what was my breach, scope, what might have been impacted. And as I mentioned, threats are becoming a reality in the cloud, not just mass deletion or somebody just spinning up a bunch of compute to mine some Bitcoin. There is legitimate malware now being deployed in the cloud. So understanding the type of malware that might be deployed, we scan every file that we protect in our cloud environments, we hash it, and we reference it against the list of known bad hashes. If we see that a bad hash has made it through the perimeter and has gotten to the data, we're going to alert you. You have a bad hash that's sitting on this system. You might want to go look at it. That's really critical to hopefully catch it before it detonates. But if it does detonate, you want to make sure you're not recovering it back. You don't want to recover that malware back and potentially reinfect yourself. So having not only threat monitoring proactively, but also threat recovery or threat hunting is what we call it, to ensure that you're not recovering that threat back is really, really critical. And then the last piece, and Doug hit on this really elegantly, I think, it's all about recovery. But in the cloud, it's all about automating the recovery because, again, time is money. So having recovery plans to recover whole applications, the ability to be able to recover from any, from our scale out platform across any region or bucket, and then having the ability to demonstrate the preparedness, the recovery to an IRE, for example, would be really important to demonstrate to a cyber insurer that you have that capability to be able to recover if you need to in the case of a large scale cyber incident. So this is really Rubrik's posture in the cloud. I had a couple more slides. I think I'll skip those and see if there are any questions in the chat. I will leave you with a couple of customer examples because they do map to the 3 C's that we talked about earlier. Pepsi uses us primarily to reduce their complexity. They have hundreds of Azure subscriptions and AWS accounts. They needed global visibility and protection through a single interface, and they get that with Rubrik. The NBA used us primarily to reduce their exfiltration risk. This is the cyber. A use case that I talked about earlier is in terms of discovering and understanding the type of data that you have so that you can set the appropriate backup policies or even remove redundant data that might be sensitive in nature. You don't want sensitive information, redundant in the environment. Multiple copies of the same information in the environment just increases your surface area for risk. And then the last one around cost. We talked about this earlier. Having optionality on where to put backup data is really just going to drive down cost. And that native snapshots moved into Rubrik Cloud Vault for Under Armour automatically led to a 32% TCO savings off of their backup storage costs, which was a huge benefit for them.
Awesome.
And that's just a sample of some customers. I'm sure some joint customers between Alchemy and Rubrik. And that's all I had. Thanks for your time, everyone. Yeah.
So Matt, we got a good question that came in. We have 2 questions that came in. So
yeah. So
the first question that came in is around kind of size, and they're asking for a smaller, kind of simpler organization. Does the security and compliance aspects of Rubrik outweigh those available via cloud native tools? So what are your thoughts there?
I want to hit on that one first, and then I want to get Matt's kind of view on it as well. But ultimately, personally, I actually think they do. Because even when you start to bring in like an Azure type thing where we're running Defender for Cloud, that aspect of, how that cloud service kind of runs, there's a couple of things that we see there. Number one is the insights are decent when it comes to Defender for Cloud. But the really hard part around that is how do you get action from it? And
That's
how
right.
you get those insights, especially when you're trying to potentially run correlation. Your security teams may have a SIM in some way, shape, or form. So if you have something like a Red Canary, a Rapid7, an Arctic Wolf, how are they gathering that information for you and then potentially actioning it based on kind of what the contracting thing is there. The other thing that I will say on that is what we see, especially in smaller shops, is a lot of the automation of the cloud that could go in play in terms of policy-based actions, in terms of standardization, are not as well defined as some of the larger orgs. So what we tend to see is a lot of configuration drift, especially with new machines. So kind of in that small, medium, that simple environment, while they may be small and simple, most of the time it's done manually, which is not a problem at all in any way, shape, or form. But from a security compliance perspective, we see a lot of things getting overlooked and missed just due to some of the speed to go through. So I think in addition to the insights, that we were talking about earlier from, being able to interrogate your data for those file hashes, being able to, work through the end user behavior analysis type things of what we see, there's also the policy aspect of it. So if you have a VM, if you have, web services, storage accounts, specific things that are coming in play, Rubrik has the ability to apply policy at a global level. So you don't have to worry about a machine coming up. This is a Linux VM. This is a Windows VM. This is an IaaS thing. This may be a scale set. This may be a web service. All of those type of actions are going to flow within the context of the Rubrik policy engine and automatically get popped into play without having to think about it. So I think for those reasons, that's one of the things that I really like about that and would absolutely put those in play. I kind of want to steal one other quick thing. And when it comes into the cross-platform stuff, there is the concept of Azure or AWS, but there's also the productivity side of the world, the things that live in cloud, but may not live within the context of a hyperscaler from a control perspective. M365, Google, those type of things, Dropbox, those are going to be items that are probably as important or more important to be able to work through that protection, that security overlay. And that is the reason that I think, especially for smaller shops, that Rubrik is a great play there. But Matt, I'll kind of kick to you to hit anything else.
I mean, I think you covered it. I've just got to add one more thing to what you said, Doug. It's validation, because AWS had very bespoke security services, things like, Macy for classification, things like our guard duty for things like anomaly detection, things like that. So their world was very bespoke. Recently, they announced Security Hub, where they tied all of those things together in a single security control plane. Guess what they're doing at reInvent this year? They are now tying their backup services into information that they get out of Security Hub. I wonder where they got that from, because that's what we do. So this is validation that backup and recovery and the intel and forensics that those services provide go hand in hand. So I feel like that was great validation essentially from AWS, that their desire is to essentially take this backup and plug it into essentially what comes out of their Security Hub. And it's really, really critical at the end of the day. So yeah, that's
awesome.
It was good.
So I don't like to obviously vendor bash here. So we got a question around kind of you guys versus, I'll just say it begins with a C and ends with the alt. And, can you tell why they should consider Rubrik over a traditional tool, like an older kind of more legacy tool?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to two things. The first is those legacy tools, while they may claim that they can wrap it all into a single interface, it's not the case. It's essentially still separated out because they were developed that way. And then the other thing I would add is that their persistent compute requirements can become very, very heavy, particularly as you add on their security services. As you add those security services on, that's just another persistent VM that you have to have running in that account or in that org. And you just keep tacking on persistent compute is going to continue to add to the cost. So that's what it's really, in my mind, those are the two things. Not to bash them. That's how they're architected. It's just, that's literally how they're architected. So it just, the cost can get driven up very quickly. And also, the inability to really tie it all together is really what I've seen.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, it's like they weren't cloud first. You guys were cloud first,
right.
mentality. So, and before we jump off today, I want to just shout out a couple call to actions. The first one is we do offer what we call our data governance mastermind sessions, and so we offer a wide variety of what we call masterminds. Think of these as a great way to get a guy like Doug in the room with you, and he assesses your data strategy, where you're at, how you're backing things up, et cetera. But it also gives you great insight to how Alchemy works in our methodology. So it's a great way, complimentary, to get a sneak peek in how we work and how we tie vendors like Rubrik into our stack. So definitely check that out. Again, I'll share these links post-session as well. But if you want to click on the QR code there and check it out, feel free. I also put the link in the chat. Another thing I would encourage you to do is on the Rubrik website. I was perusing it today and just, digging into my partner portal, and I was going check out if they got click-through demos, and they do. And so I definitely recommend you go check out what they call their demo
story lane demos. Yeah, they're great.
You can literally spin up a quick demo, and it gives you step-by-step, follow this, do this. And there's a ton of them on this page. So I highly recommend going to this link, and I'll put that link into the chat in a second before we exit out. And I will also share that post session as well. So those are your two good call to actions here today. And, if anything, definitely check out these click-through tours. And I'd highly recommend our mastermind sessions. We have a bunch of different options outside of data as well. All right. And with that, we're going to wrap up today's session. And I always like to end on a good note. So I always ask my presenters, so Doug, any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with today?
I think I'll kind of end with what I started. And with most of that data protection service, the effort is not in the backup. It's in the recovery. So consider that as you start to move forward and, start to add complexity in terms of cloud, prem, multi-cloud, et cetera.
Awesome. And then Matt, any final questions for you today? Or any final thoughts you want to leave the audience?
I do have a final thought. I guess what I would say is that governance workshop that Alchemy is doing, take advantage of something like that, because overly permissive identities is becoming a huge problem in cloud, particularly with the advent of AI and the fact that AI needs access to such a wide swath of data. That overly permissive identities are becoming a really, really big pain point and the top cyber concern for cloud forward shops. So please take advantage of things like that, especially if they're offered as a free service. It's critical. So that's it.
Awesome. Well, gents, I want to thank you for jumping on today and joining us in the labs. But thank you, Rubrik, for jumping in today. And thanks everybody for joining us on our In the Lab. And as I always say, have a great day and see you all on the flip side.